The restaurant was a picture of luxury bathed in the warm glow of Christmas lights. Elegant chandeliers sparkled like stars above the room, while garlands of evergreen and golden ornaments adorned every corner. A grand Christmas tree stood in the center, its twinkling lights casting a festive glow over the bustling space. The hum of soft jazz music blended with the cheerful chatter of wealthy guests, each dressed in designer attire, sipping on expensive champagne. Among the crowd, he stood out the billionaire. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit immaculate, and his every movement spoke of power. He exuded confidence, holding court at the largest table, surrounded by admirers who laughed at his every word, whether they meant it or not. His voice carried through the room louder than anyone else's, as if he owned not just the restaurant, but everyone in it. Across the room, unnoticed by most, the waitress moved swiftly between tables. Her uniform was spotless, her demeanor calm and professional, yet there was a quiet dignity about her. She was young with a determined air that hinted at a life far removed from the opulence around her. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, delivering plates and clearing tables, her focus unwavering despite the chaos. Yet beneath the surface of this festive scene, an undercurrent of tension lingered. The billionaire's gaze occasionally followed the waitress, not with curiosity, but with something sharper, something belittling. His loud laughter and pointed remarks often seemed aimed at her, though she pretended not to notice. The room, though bustling, seemed to hold its breath whenever he turned his attention her way, as if the weight of his words could pierce through the holiday cheer at any moment. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the festive decorations felt almost out of place, like a mask hiding the subtle unease. It was clear in this moment the glitz and glamour of Christmas could not disguise the imbalance of power playing out in the room. The night was far from over, and the mood, though polished on the surface, carried a tension that could shatter with a single spark. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, surveying the room with a self-satisfied grin, as if the entire evening revolved around him. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on the waitress as she passed by, effortlessly moving between tables. His lips curled into a smirk, and his voice rang out, cutting through the hum of conversation. "Hey, sweetheart," he called, his tone dripping with condescension. The waitress paused, a slight hesitation, before she turned toward him. He didn't wait for her to approach. Instead, he raised his glass, gesturing grandly toward the center of the room. "Why don't you give us a little Christmas carol? Show us what you've got." There was a sharp edge to his words, a clear implication that he wasn't asking, but demanding an order wrapped in mock politeness. His guests chuckled, but the sound was hollow, knowing it was less a suggestion and more an attempt to assert his dominance in front of everyone. The room fell silent for a beat, as if the air itself held its breath, all eyes now on the waitress. She stood still for a moment, processing what was happening. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of surprise and discomfort. She had worked this job countless times before, serving with grace, but never had she been subjected to something so cruel. The guests, well-dressed and well-heeled, exchanged glances, but said nothing. They knew better than to question the billionaire. He was, after all, the one paying for the lavish dinner. The billionaire's eyes never left her, his smile widening as he leaned forward. "Come on," he taunted. "I'm sure you've got a voice in there somewhere. Show us. Maybe it'll be your big break." His laughter echoed across the room, and a few of his guests joined in, but there was no real humor in it, only the weight of mockery. She stood frozen for a moment longer, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Her heart raced, her mind scrambled for a way out, but there was no escape. The room had gone quiet, the attention now fully on her, and the billionaire knew it. The imbalance was palpable. She was just a servant in his eyes, nothing more than a prop for his amusement. And yet, in that silence, something began to stir in her. The waitress stood there frozen for a split second as the eyes of the room bore down on her. A knot formed in her stomach, the familiar rush of discomfort creeping up her spine. Her fingers tightened around the tray. She held her breath, catching in her throat. She had worked in places like this before, seen the sharp glances, felt the silent judgments, but never had she been so blatantly singled out. Fear crept into her chest, cold and uninvited. What would happen if she refused? She could feel the weight of the billionaire's gaze, like a spotlight shining down on her, forcing her to shrink under its intensity. The thought of saying no, of standing her ground, seemed impossible in that moment. His mocking tone still echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of the power he held. But then, beneath the layers of fear and embarrassment, there was something else. Frustration bubbled up, sharp and sudden, like a spark ready to catch. Why should she let him control her this way? Why should she let him strip away her dignity in front of a room full of people? The pressure of the moment pressed in on her, but in that suffocating silence, a small but growing fire ignited within her. She hesitated just for a moment, long enough to let the weight of the situation settle in. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she set the tray down carefully. She wasn't sure if it was courage or defiance, but something pushed her to act. Without another word, she stepped into the center of the room, the eyes of the guests still fixed on her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. The billionaire's smirk never wavered, but she wasn't looking at him now. She was focused on the small space before her, the sudden quiet of the room pressing in, and the uncertainty of what would happen next. She drew a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The room was waiting, silent, expectant. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed like the world had narrowed down to just her, and the sound that would soon escape her. She opened her mouth, the first note tentative at first, but then it came strong, steady, and unmistakably powerful. The sound filled the room, pure and rich, reverberating off the walls. It was a voice like no other, soulful, deep, and filled with an emotion that seemed to come from a place far beyond the walls of that restaurant. The words flowed effortlessly, each note laced with raw passion. Her voice, so full of life, rang out, cutting through the stillness of the room like a sharp yet delicate blade. The guests, once chatty and laughing, fell into an unnatural silence. They stood frozen, eyes wide, as if the very air had shifted. The richness of her voice wrapped around them, pulling them in. For a brief moment, it was as if nothing else existed in the room, but her voice, each note an invitation to something deeper, more real than the world they had known. The billionaire, who had once mocked her, who had looked down on her, was now utterly still. His mouth hung slightly open, eyes wide in disbelief, as the sound seemed to wash over him, and the walls he had so confidently built around himself began to crumble. Her song rose and fell with such grace and power, it was impossible not to feel the weight of it. She wasn't just singing, she was speaking directly to the hearts of everyone in that room. The air grew thick with reverence, the festive decorations now almost forgotten in the wake of this unexpected performance. The billionaire's smirk had long disappeared, replaced by something else, something unrecognizable. He was no longer in control, no longer the one commanding the room. As the last note lingered in the air, there was a collective breath, held a moment suspended in time before the room exhaled together, as if released from a spell. But even in the silence that followed, it was clear that something profound had happened. The atmosphere had shifted, the tone of the evening had completely transformed. What had been a night of superficial chatter and mockery was now a moment of awe, as the waitress's voice had commanded not just the room, but the very hearts of those who had once underestimated her. At first, the billionaire sat motionless, as though frozen in time. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape, still caught in the shock of her voice. He blinked a few times, as if trying to process what had just happened, but the sound of her song lingered in his ears, refusing to let him shake it off. His chest tightened as the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just a good performance. This was something else entirely. His usual confidence, which had so effortlessly dominated every room, now seemed out of place. He sat straighter in his chair, the smirk gone, replaced by an unreadable expression. The guests around him, once drawn to his every word, now shifted their attention back to the waitress murmuring among themselves in awe. His eyes followed her, though he no longer saw a servant, a woman to mock. He saw a person, a talented, powerful individual, who had just stripped away his layers of arrogance with a single song. A flicker of guilt crossed his face, though he quickly masked it. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, trying to regain his composure, but the tension in his posture was palpable. The billionaire's shoulders, once relaxed and carefree, had tensed as though the weight of his own actions was finally sinking in. He rubbed his chin, his fingers moving slowly as if seeking to ground himself in the reality that this woman who he had so carelessly belittled had something far more valuable than all his wealth or status. Admiration, though subtle, flickered in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the depth of her talent. His face softened slightly, the edges of his expression no longer sharp. The self-assurance he had once worn like armor now felt hollow, replaced by something unfamiliar. Regret. A silent understanding that he had misjudged her, that his behavior had been cruel, unwarranted, and disrespectful. For a fleeting moment, the billionaire's posture shifted, his back slightly hunched, as though he was suddenly aware of his vulnerability. As the last echoes of her song faded, he remained silent, lost in thought. He didn't look at anyone else in the room. Instead, his gaze lingered on the woman who had humbled him without a word. The harshness of his earlier mockery seemed to weigh heavier with each passing second, and his once ironclad sense of superiority began to unravel quietly. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The guests, once chatting among themselves and oblivious to the power dynamics at play, now watched the waitress with a new reverence. Whispers floated through the air, not of judgment or mockery, but of admiration. Her voice had done more than entertain, had captivated them, stripped away their indifference, and revealed a depth of talent they had never expected. No longer did the guests eye her with the same detached air they had before. The room had shifted in its gaze. People who had once ignored her presence now regarded her with respect, some nodding in silent acknowledgement, others exchanging looks of quiet admiration. The power had subtly shifted from the billionaire, whose once commanding presence now seemed small and insignificant in the face of such raw talent. The billionaire, his expression no longer smug or condescending, now sat motionless, the weight of his actions hanging over him. His eyes flicked toward the waitress, and for a moment they met hers. There was no longer arrogance in his gaze, only a flicker of humility, an understanding of how wrong he had been. His lips parted as if to say something, but the words seemed to escape him. Finally, after a long pause, he cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly, his voice soft but genuine. That was incredible. His words felt almost too small for the impact her performance had left. He wasn't one to admit his mistakes easily, but in that moment, it seemed the power of her voice had left him speechless, unsure of how to truly make amends. Meanwhile, the waitress stood there still, her heart pounding, but something had changed. She no longer felt the sting of humiliation that had gripped her earlier. Instead, a quiet pride bloomed within her. The weight of the moment had lifted, and in its place was a sense of empowerment. She didn't need his apology. Her talent had already spoken for her. Her posture had shifted subtly, no longer hunched or hesitant. There was a grace to her now, an inner strength that had been drawn out not by words, but by her own voice. The guests continued to look her way, some still unsure of how to respond, but it didn't matter to her. She knew deep down that this was her moment, a moment not defined by the billionaire's cruel taunts, but by the power of her voice to transform the entire room. The story of this waitress is a powerful reminder that talent and courage can break through even the toughest barriers. In a world where people are often judged by their appearance, their status, or their role, it's moments like these that prove how deeply artistry and strength of character can change the course of a situation. Her voice didn't just fill the room, It shattered the prejudice and arrogance that tried to keep her down. Sometimes all it takes is one moment to remind the world of someone's worth. One moment where a person stands up, speaks out, or sings out and changes everything. Never underestimate the power of standing tall in your truth. We can all learn from this moment to treat each person with kindness and respect, no matter their background or their position. Everyone has something unique to offer, and no one should ever be judged by their circumstances. If you were inspired by this story, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the power of human resilience and talent. Please note, this is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. While the events and characters are not real, the message about the power of talent, courage, and respect is something we can all relate to. Thank you for watching, and we hope it inspires you.